Hi everybody, welcome back. Glad you could tune in again. I want to share with you one of the most encouraging little backstories that I know of in the whole of the New Testament. You know, when you read the New Testament, you discover all the major characters and you really feel you'll getting to know them. People like Jesus, obviously, and Peter and Paul. But alongside them, you meet other people who pop up somewhat less frequently. And what's intriguing is you do get to know them a little bit, but there are bits of their lives which you have to kind of scratch around really carefully and try and figure out what their life was actually like and what they're actually doing. And one of those characters we actually encountered in last night's Bible study when we were finishing off 1 Peter. Peter mentions him, and I have in mind Mark, sometimes called John Mark, the author of the second Gospel. And Peter addresses him, or speaks of him, sending greetings, using the phrase, "Mark, my son." And that is a remarkable thing for Peter to have said of Mark, and I want to explain why. And to do so, I need to tell you then the wonderful story of the life of Mark. Just a little background to start with. Mark, the author of the second Gospel, left his signature on the Gospel in the form of the little description of the man who ran away naked during the final days of Jesus. And that he's described there as a young man, so probably no more than 20 years old, maybe about 20. So we've got to place his date of birth sometime around about 10 or 12 AD. And he became an associate of Peter later in his life, hence the connection with Peter. But we need to understand a little bit more about his earlier life in order to really get to grips with what's so significant about that mention in 1 Peter 5. In the earliest days of the church, there were basically two centres of activity. One, of course, was in Jerusalem. The other was in Antioch of Syria, not Pisidian Antioch, come to that in a second, but Antioch of Syria. Now, Antioch in Syria was a place where the gospel was experiencing great growth. The hand of the Lord was on the ministry there. There was a tremendous blessing, quite a considerable amount of influence in the whole surrounding society, and the church formed a kind of happy and stable community. In contrast with Jerusalem, where there was still great growth, but there was a great deal of persecution. And of course, you know that James was killed, Peter and John were arrested, all these kinds of terrible things happened in the early days in Jerusalem. There was a famine in Jerusalem, and the church sent church in Antioch of Syria sent a gift to the Jerusalem church by the hand of Barnabas and Paul. Now, Mark lived in Jerusalem, and in fact he was very much in the centre of the action. If you read Acts chapter 12, you discover that his mother's house was the place where they were praying for Peter's release from prison during that particular imprisonment, and when Peter was eventually released, that's where he went back to. And so he was, so to speak, in the heart of things. He was accustomed to the having to look out for yourself the whole time in a church that was undergoing a certain amount of persecution, but at the same time it was an exciting time, a time of great growth and blessing in that kind of way as the gospel began to spread. Now, Barnabas and Mark, you know, Barnabas, one of Paul's associates, were cousins. And so when Paul and Barnabas left Jerusalem and went back up north to Syrian Antioch, they took Mark with them. Now, this would have been quite a significant moment for Mark. He's leaving a place where there is persecution but growth, and going to a place where there is growth and blessing and excitement. And many of the problems that he'd faced living with his mum in Jerusalem would have been somewhat left behind him. He left the place of hostility and suffering and danger and went to this place where the gospel really was experiencing great blessing. And that blessing continued. If you read Acts 13, just in the first couple of verses, you notice that Paul and Barnabas went off on their first missionary journey from Antioch of Syria, and they actually took Mark with them. And there, as they went on their journey, the blessing continued. Look at the map that should appear on the screen in a moment or so. You'll see that they took the boat to Cyprus, and as they went through Cyprus, you find this narrated in Acts chapter 13. Again, there was a tremendous amount of growth and success of the gospel there. There was this confrontation with Bar Jesus, or Elymas, the Jewish magician and false prophet, in which the power of God was evidently at work. The proconsul, Sergius Paulus, was converted, and Paul and Barnabas and Mark made their way west across the island, where they set sail for the next port of call on Paul's first missionary journey. They took a boat from Paphos in Cyprus and went to Perga to the north on the mainland. Their intention was to head north 120 miles or so, slightly northwest, but just slightly west of northwest, I guess you'd say, to Antioch of Pisidia, Pisidian Antioch, the other Antioch, if you've been reading the book of Acts. Now, that journey would have taken them over the very western end of what we now call the Taurus Mountains. Check out these couple of pictures if you want to see what they would have seen as they walked inland. As you head north from Perga through the region of Pamphylia, which is the region by the coast, there's a broad coastal plain following a couple of rivers north. But as you walk along the rivers, which is presumably where the path would have taken them, you see these mountains looming towards you. Some of those mountains are 9,000 or 9,500 feet high. The highest of them is now the best place for skiing in the whole of Turkey. It is not a place where it's very comfortable to be walking around in sandals in the first century. And of course, at this point, Mark, for the first time in a long time, faced some difficult challenges. It's dry and hot and barren in the summer. It's bitterly cold at night, especially in the winter. And you can imagine him walking north with Paul and Barnabas and seeing the looming majesty of the Taurus Mountains before him. For the first time in his life, he has a long and painful and obviously unpleasant and dangerous journey ahead of him. What's he going to do? Well, of course, you know what he did. We discover a couple of chapters later in the book of Acts that Mark deserted them, took a boat, and apparently went back to Jerusalem, where his mother lived. And all that happened around 44 AD during Paul's missionary journey. Well, Paul's journey continued. Paul and Barnabas continued north, went to Pisidian Antioch, all the various things, came back through Perga. It was a number of years before they were back in Jerusalem, before they would have met Mark again, around about the time of the council in Jerusalem, maybe 48 AD, maybe 50 or even 51 AD, somewhere between 4 and 7 years later. And you wonder what's going to happen at that point. So they meet the young man Mark, at this point perhaps in his early 30s, maybe mid-30s. He's deserted the great apostle Paul on his first great missionary journey. There he is back skulking in Jerusalem because he lacked the courage to take on the might of the Taurus Mountains. What's going to happen? Well, you know very well what's going to happen. The trouble and strife continued. There's actually a disagreement between Paul and Barnabas in Acts chapter 15 after the council at Jerusalem, where Barnabas wanted to take John called Mark with them on the next stage of their journey, but Paul refused because he had deserted them in Pamphylia, that region where they're walking up towards the Taurus Mountains, and it starts to look pretty daunting. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Paul and Barnabas separated because Barnabas wanted to take his cousin, John Mark, with him, and Paul refused. So now imagine yourself in the shoes of Mark. Not only have you deserted the apostle at his hour of need, it turns out from Galatians 4 that he was ill during that time of that journey. How he would have needed a younger man to support and assist him. And Mark deserted his friend Paul. More than that, he's been the cause of this great division between Paul and Barnabas. How's he going to be feeling? Well, you can only imagine his bitterness of soul and his anxiety about what he should say or about what he should do. Wouldn't it be interesting to know what happened to Mark subsequently? Well, it turns out that we know what happened to Mark subsequently. We know that at some point he was reconciled with Paul. Paul writes towards the end of his life, at the end of 2 Timothy, about Mark. He says, "Get Mark and bring him to me because he's very useful to me in my ministry." What a wonderful thing to say about a man who once had deserted you and abandoned you in your darkest hour of need. Presumably, Mark had the courage and the strength of character to go back to his friend Paul and just apologise for what he'd done. And more than that, clearly he was reconciled with the Christian community as a whole, because not only Paul, but also Barnabas, presumably, who'd always been happy to still remain with him, but also Peter, the leader of the other great branch of the early church, describes him as my son. Peter, the one who knew all about betraying others and then being welcomed back into the fold. Peter expresses very clearly at the end of 1 Peter in chapter 5 verse 13 his sense of being one with this young man. It is a remarkable story of a man who had ups and downs of all kinds, but who, when he realised that he'd made a mistake, he'd let his brothers and sisters down, had the courage and integrity to apologise and take the new opportunity that was presented to him. Well, I find that encouraging. I hope you do. And I hope that the Lord blesses you today. Be praying for you all. And I hope very much to see you soon. Bye for now.